The gunshot echoed across the canyon just as the sky opened up, and rain began falling in sheets so thick that Daniel Preston could barely see his horse's ears. And he knew that somewhere in this God-forsaken stretch of Nevada territory, someone was either celebrating or dying. Daniel had been riding toward Piotr for 3 days straight, carrying nothing but his bedroll, his father's old Colt revolver, a canteen that needed refilling, and the weight of a life he was trying to leave behind in Colorado. The mining town of Piotr had a reputation for being rough, lawless, and exactly the kind of place where a man could disappear into honest work and forget that he had once worn a different name in a different territory. He was 24 years old, and he felt ancient. The rain came down harder, turning the dusty trail into a river of mud within minutes. Daniel pulled his hat lower and urged his mare forward, but the animal balked, ears flattening against her skull. That was when he heard it over the roar of the storm. A scream, high and terrified, coming from somewhere to his left where the land dropped away toward the creek bed. Daniel did not hesitate. He swung down from the saddle and ran toward the sound, his boots sliding in the mud. The creek that had been nothing but a trickle of water that morning had transformed into a raging torrent, brown and violent, carrying branches and debris downstream with terrifying speed. And there, clinging to a half-submerged cottonwood tree about 20 feet from the bank, was a young woman in a pale blue dress that billowed around her like a drowning flower. "Hold on," Daniel shouted, though he doubted she could hear him over the roar of the water. He looked around frantically for something, anything that could help. His rope was still on his saddle. He sprinted back, grabbed it, and returned to the edge of the swollen creek, his heart hammering against his ribs. The woman's face was white with terror, her dark hair plastered to her cheeks. She was losing her grip. Daniel could see it in the way her fingers kept slipping on the wet bark. He had maybe a minute, probably less. He tied one end of the rope around a sturdy pine tree that grew at an angle near the bank, then wrapped the other end around his waist, making sure the knot would hold. Then he waded into the water. The current hit him like a physical blow, trying to sweep his legs out from under him. The water was cold, snowmelt from the mountains mixed with rain, and it stole the breath from his lungs. Daniel pushed forward, using the rope as a lifeline, fighting for every step. The creek bottom was uneven, full of holes and rocks that tried to trip him. Twice he went under, swallowing muddy water, but he kept moving toward the woman. "I'm coming," he called out. "Just hold on a little longer." When he finally reached her, he could see that she was younger than he had first thought, maybe 19 or 20, with green eyes that were wide with fear and exhaustion. Her lips were turning blue. "I've got you," Daniel said, wrapping one arm around her waist. "Let go of the tree." "I can't," she gasped. "I can't swim, I'll drown." "You won't drown. I've got you, trust me." For a moment their eyes met, and something passed between them in that look, some wordless understanding. Then she released her grip on the tree, and they were both swept downstream. Daniel held her tight with one arm while his other hand grabbed for the rope. The current spun them, dragged them under, tried to separate them. His shoulder screamed in pain as the rope went taut, but he did not let go of the woman. He pulled them hand over hand back toward the bank, using the rope as a guide, his muscles burning with the effort. They finally reached the shallows, and Daniel half carried, half dragged the woman up onto the muddy bank where they both collapsed, coughing and gasping. The rain still poured down, but it seemed gentle compared to the violence of the creek. "Are you hurt?" Daniel asked when he could speak again. The woman shook her head, still coughing up water. "I don't think so. My wagon, it went into the creek. Everything we had." "You're alive," Daniel said. "That's what matters." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw something shift in her expression, gratitude mixing with something else he could not quite name. "You saved my life. You could have died." "But I didn't," Daniel said simply. He got to his feet, legs shaking, and offered her his hand. "Can you stand?" She took his hand and he pulled her up. She swayed slightly and he steadied her. "What's your name?" "Grace," she said. "Grace Foster. I was traveling with my uncle to Piach. We were supposed to meet my father there. He's been working in the mines. But the wagon hit a soft spot in the road and went right into the creek. My uncle. He tried to jump clear, but I saw him go under. I don't think he made it out." Daniel felt his stomach sink. "I'm sorry. We should look for him." They searched the banks of the creek for over an hour, but they found no sign of Grace's uncle. The storm began to ease, but the light was fading. Finally, Daniel had to accept what Grace already seemed to know. Her uncle was gone, taken by the flood. "We need to get you somewhere warm and dry," Daniel said gently. "Piach is still about 6 miles up the road." "Can you ride?" "I think so," Grace said, though she was shivering violently now, shock and cold setting in. Daniel retrieved his horse, who had wandered a short distance but had stayed nearby, and helped Grace into the saddle. Then he swung up behind her, wrapping his arms around her to take the reins. He could feel her trembling against him. They rode through the twilight toward Piach, Daniel acutely aware of the woman in his arms, of her small frame and the way she seemed to be trying very hard not to fall apart. He had expected to arrive in this town as a solitary man looking for work and anonymity. Instead, he was bringing with him a young woman who had lost everything, including the only family member she had been traveling with. Piach appeared as the last light left the sky, a rough collection of buildings clinging to the hillside, dominated by mine headframes and the glow of lanterns in windows. The town had been born from a silver strike about 6 years earlier, in 1864, and it had the chaotic energy of a place where fortunes could be made or lost in a single day. Daniel had heard that it was one of the most dangerous towns in the West, with killings so common that the cemetery was filling up faster than the population could grow. He guided his horse down the main street, looking for somewhere respectable. Most of the buildings were saloons, gambling houses, or businesses catering to miners with money burning holes in their pockets. Finally, he spotted a sign for a boarding house run by a Mrs. Ellen Palmer. It looked cleaner than most of the other establishments. Daniel dismounted and helped Grace down. She could barely stand. He steadied her with one arm and knocked on the door of the boarding house. A woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and a no-nonsense expression opened the door. Her eyes went immediately to Grace's bedraggled appearance, then to Daniel's equally wet clothes. "We need a room," Daniel said. "Separate rooms, actually. This lady was caught in the flooding. She needs somewhere warm and dry." Mrs. Palmer's expression softened slightly. "Come in, both of you." "Lord have mercy. You look half drowned." She stepped aside to let them enter. The interior was simple but clean, with a fire burning in a stone fireplace that filled the room with blessed warmth. "I'll get some blankets and hot water," Mrs. Palmer said briskly. "Young lady, you come with me. You need to get out of those wet things before you catch your death. And you, sir?" "Daniel Preston," he said. "I just rode in from Colorado." "Well, Mr. Preston, there's a room upstairs on the right that's available. I'll have some hot coffee sent up. 25 cents a night, meals included." "Thank you, madam." Mrs. Palmer led Grace away toward a room at the back of the house, and Daniel climbed the narrow stairs to the room she had indicated. It was small but adequate, with a bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the street. He peeled off his wet clothes and wrapped himself in the blanket from the bed, then stood at the window watching the town below. He thought about Grace Foster, about the feel of her in his arms during that ride into town, about the way she had looked at him on the bank of that creek. Daniel had not been looking for anyone. After what had happened in Colorado, after watching his father drink himself to death following his mother's passing, after the failed attempt to keep the family ranch running, after the humiliation of losing everything to debt, Daniel had decided that solitude was safer. People you loved could hurt you simply by leaving, whether they meant to or not. But there was something about Grace that had gotten under his skin in the space of those few desperate minutes in the water. Maybe it was the trust she had shown when she let go of that tree. Maybe it was the quiet strength he sensed beneath her fear. Or maybe it was simply that he had pulled her from the water and now felt responsible for her in some way he did not fully understand. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Palmer stood there with a cup of coffee and a plate of bread and cold meat. "The young lady is resting," she said. "She told me about her uncle. That's a hard thing. She said her father is Jacob Foster, one of the miners working the Raymond and Ely claim. I know him slightly. Good man. Someone will need to tell him what happened." "I'll do it," Daniel said. "Tomorrow when he's likely to be in town." Mrs. Palmer nodded approvingly. "She also said you saved her life, went right into that flooded creek to pull her out. That was either very brave or very foolish." "Probably a bit of both," Daniel admitted. "Well, either way, you did a good thing." Mrs. Palmer turned to leave, then paused. "There's work in Piatch if you're looking. The mines always need men, or if you're not inclined to go underground, there's plenty of other work. Freighting, building, ranching in the valleys outside town. A man willing to work hard can make a life here." "Thank you, Mrs. Palmer. I appreciate it." After she left, Daniel ate the simple meal and drank the coffee, feeling warmth slowly return to his bones. He lay down on the bed, intending to rest for just a few minutes, but exhaustion pulled him under into a deep, dreamless sleep. He woke to bright sunlight streaming through the window and the sounds of the town already busy with morning activity. Daniel dressed in his spare clothes, the only dry ones he had, and went downstairs. Mrs. Palmer was in the kitchen, and the smell of frying bacon made his stomach growl. "Miss Foster is in the dining room," Mrs. Palmer said without preamble. "She's been up for an hour, wouldn't rest any longer." Daniel found Grace sitting at a long wooden table, wrapped in a borrowed shawl, her dark hair now dry and falling in waves past her shoulders. She looked up when he entered, and he saw that her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but there was a determined set to her jaw. "Mr. Preston," she said, "I wanted to thank you properly. What you did yesterday, going into that water after me, I cannot ever repay that." "You don't need to repay anything," Daniel said, sitting down across from her. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Grace said firmly, "not anyone. Most people would have stayed safe on the bank. You risked your life for a stranger." Mrs. Palmer brought them both plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, along with fresh coffee. For a few minutes they ate in silence. Then Grace spoke again. "I need to find my father and tell him about Uncle Thomas. He was my mother's brother. They were very close. This will break his heart." "I'll go with you," Daniel offered. "Mrs. Palmer says your father works the Raymond and Ely claim. We can ride out there this morning if you're up for it." "I am," Grace said. "I need to do this." They borrowed a horse from the livery stable for Grace, and Daniel saddled his own mare. The ride to the mine took them out of town and up into the hills where the silver veins ran through the rock like frozen lightning. The morning was clear and cool, the storm having washed the air clean, though evidence of yesterday's violence was everywhere in the form of eroded gullies and debris scattered across the landscape. Grace rode well, Daniel noticed, sitting straight in the saddle despite what she had been through. She had changed into a simple brown dress that Mrs. Palmer had lent her, and with her hair pulled back and her shoulders squared. She looked like someone who had decided to face whatever came next with courage. The Raymond and Ely mine was a sprawling operation with several shaft openings, piles of tailings, and a collection of rough buildings where ore was processed. Men moved about with the purposeful energy of those who knew that every minute represented potential profit or loss. Daniel and Grace dismounted near what looked like an office building, and Grace asked a passing worker where she might find Jacob Foster. "Old Jake. He is probably down in Shaft 3. Should be coming up for the noon meal soon. You can wait in the office if you want." They waited in the small office, surrounded by the sounds of the mine. The rumble of ore carts, the ring of picks on stone, the shouts of men coordinating their work. About 20 minutes later, a man came in from the bright sunlight outside, his face streaked with dust, his clothes coated in rock powder. He was in his late 40s, stocky and strong with Grace's same green eyes. "Grace!" His face lit up with surprise and joy. Then he looked more closely at her expression and the joy faded. "What is it? Where is Thomas?" Grace stood, and Daniel saw her hands clench into fists at her sides, gathering her courage. "Papa, there was an accident yesterday. The storm. The creek flooded and the wagon went into the water." "Uncle Thomas, he did not make it. I'm so sorry." Jacob Foster stood very still for a long moment, his face going blank with shock. Then he slowly sank into a chair, suddenly looking much older. "Thomas," he said quietly. "My God, Thomas." Grace went to her father and put her arms around him, and Daniel looked away, giving them privacy in their grief. He stepped outside and stood in the sunlight, watching the mine operations without really seeing them, thinking about loss and family and the cruel randomness of fate. After a while, Grace and her father emerged. Jacob had composed himself, though his eyes were red. He approached Daniel and extended his hand. "My daughter tells me you pulled her out of that creek, risked your life to save hers. I don't have words adequate to thank you." Daniel shook his hand. "I'm just glad I was there, Mr. Foster. Please call me Jacob." He looked at Daniel with sharp assessment. "Grace says you just arrived in Piotch. Are you looking for work?" "I am," Daniel admitted. "Can you handle horses?" "We need someone to manage the stock we use for hauling ore down to the stamp mill. It is hard work but honest, and it pays better than going underground. If you are interested, the job is yours. I owe you my daughter's life. It is the least I can offer." Daniel hesitated. He had not expected this, had not planned to become entangled in the lives of these people. But he needed work, and there was something appealing about staying near Grace, about not saying goodbye to her just yet. "I would be grateful for the opportunity," Daniel said. "Then it is settled. You can start tomorrow. There is a bunkhouse for the workers near the stable. It is not fancy, but it is dry and warm." They made arrangements for Daniel to move his few possessions out to the mine the next day. And then Jacob took Grace aside to talk privately about arrangements for his brother-in-law. Daniel waited with the horses, and when Grace returned, her eyes were wet again, but her expression was calmer. "Papa is going to stay at the mine tonight," she said as they rode back toward Piotch. "There is too much work for him to leave right now. We will hold a service for Uncle Thomas in a few days. Papa asked if you would attend." "Of course," Daniel said. "I would be honored." They rode in silence for a while, and then Grace spoke again, her voice quiet. "I keep thinking about yesterday, about the moment when you reached me in the water. I was so tired, so cold. I had decided to let go, to just slip under and let it be over. And then you were there and you said you had me, and I believed you. I do not know why, but I believed you." "I'm glad you did," Daniel said. "What brought you to Nevada?" Grace asked. "You don't have to answer if you would rather not talk about it." Daniel considered his answer carefully. "I was running away, I suppose. My parents are both gone. My father died about 6 months ago, drank himself to death after my mother passed from pneumonia. We had a ranch in Colorado, but I could not hold on to it, lost it to debt. I wanted to go somewhere new, somewhere I could start over without the weight of all those failures hanging around my neck. That does not sound like running away, Grace said. It sounds like moving forward. Maybe, Daniel said. What about you? Why were you coming to Piach? My father sent for me after my mother died last year. I have been living with Uncle Thomas in Missouri, but Papa wanted me here. He said he had saved enough money from the mine that we could start a ranch in one of the valleys, something more stable than mining. He wants to give me a good life, a future. She paused. Uncle Thomas agreed to bring me because he wanted to see his sister's widower, make sure Papa was doing all right. And now he is gone, and I cannot help but think that if I had not come, if I had just stayed in Missouri, he would still be alive. You cannot think that way, Daniel said gently. What happened was an accident, a terrible accident, but it was not your fault. Grace was quiet for a moment. Thank you for saying that. Even if I do not quite believe it yet, thank you. They reached Piach as the afternoon sun painted the hills in shades of gold and amber. Daniel helped Grace dismount outside Mrs. Palmer's boarding house, and their hands touched briefly. He felt something like electricity pass between them, a connection he could not explain. I will see you at the service, Grace said. Yes, Daniel replied. And I'll be at the mine starting tomorrow. If you need anything at all, just send word. Grace smiled then, a small, sad smile, but genuine. You have already done so much, but thank you for everything. Daniel watched her go inside, then rode slowly to the livery to return the borrowed horse. His mind was full of Grace Foster, of her green eyes and quiet strength, of the way she had felt in his arms during that ride into town. He told himself not to be foolish, that she was grieving and vulnerable, and the last thing she needed was some cowboy with a complicated past developing feelings for her. But his heart, it seemed, was not interested in listening to reason. The next morning, Daniel packed his few belongings and rode out to the Raymond and Ely mine. Jacob Foster met him and showed him to the stable area, where about 20 horses and mules were kept for hauling ore carts and pulling wagons loaded with silver down the rough mountain roads to the stamp mill where the ore was processed. Most of these animals are worked hard, Jacob explained. They need someone who knows how to keep them healthy and sound. The last man we had looking after them did not care much, and we lost 3 good mules to exhaustion and neglect before I fired him. I need someone who understands that these animals are as important to the operation as any of the miners. I grew up around horses, Daniel said. My father bred them on our ranch. He taught me that if you take care of your stock, they will take care of you. Jacob nodded approvingly. Good. The bunkhouse is over there. You will eat with the other workers. Meals are provided, and you will get $30 a month plus room and board. Sundays are your own time unless there is an emergency. Daniel spent that first day assessing the stock, checking hooves, teeth, and overall condition. Several of the animals had minor issues that had been ignored. A mare with an infected cut on her leg, a mule with an impacted hoof, a gelding that was severely underweight. He set about treating them, working with a calm, patient manner that the animals responded to. By the end of the day, he was exhausted but satisfied. He had dinner in the bunkhouse with the other workers, mostly men who spent their days underground and who talked about ore quality, tunnel stability, and the eternal hope of striking a rich vein that would make them wealthy. Daniel listened more than he talked, learning about the mine and the men who worked it. The service for Thomas Foster was held 3 days later in Piach's small church, a rough wooden building that served multiple denominations. The turnout was modest, mostly people who knew Jacob through his work at the mine. Grace wore a black dress borrowed from Mrs. Palmer, and she stood beside her father with her head high and her eyes dry, though Daniel could see the grief etched into every line of her face. After the service, people gathered at Mrs. Palmer's boarding house for a simple meal. Daniel found himself standing with Grace on the front porch away from the crowd. "How are you managing?" he asked. "I am managing," Grace said. "Papa needs me to be strong, so I am being strong. There will be time for falling apart later, I suppose." "Strength is good," Daniel said. "But so is letting yourself feel what you feel." Grace looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "You are a surprising man, Daniel Preston." "Most cowboys I have met would not say something like that." "Maybe I am not like most cowboys," Daniel said. "No," Grace agreed softly. "You are not." Over the following weeks, Daniel settled into life at the mine. He worked with the horses, ensuring they were healthy and well cared for. He proved himself reliable and skilled, and Jacob Foster began giving him additional responsibilities, including supervising the teamsters who drove the ore wagons. The work was hard but satisfying, and Daniel found that he enjoyed the routine, the sense of purpose. Grace visited the mine several times each week, bringing her father lunch or helping with bookkeeping in the mine office. Daniel looked forward to these visits more than he wanted to admit. They would talk while he worked, conversations that ranged from the mundane to the profound. He learned that Grace loved reading, that she had taught school for a year in Missouri, that she dreamed of having a home of her own someday, a place where she could put down roots. "Papa still talks about starting a ranch," she told Daniel one afternoon as he brushed down one of the mares. "He has been looking at land in the valley north of here. Good water, good grass. He thinks in another year he will have saved enough to make it happen." "That sounds like a good dream," Daniel said. "What about you?" Grace asked. "Do you have dreams, Daniel?" He paused, considering the question. "I used to dream about keeping my family's ranch going, about honoring what my parents built. But that dream died when I lost the land. I suppose I am still figuring out what comes next." "Maybe you will figure it out here," Grace said. "Maybe," Daniel agreed. But he was beginning to realize that his dreams were changing, reshaping themselves around a dark-haired woman with green eyes, who made him think about futures he had thought were lost to him. One Sunday in late summer, Grace asked Daniel if he would accompany her on a ride into the valley her father was considering for his ranch. "I want to see it," she explained. "Papa has described it, but I want to see it for myself, and I would feel safer with you along." Daniel agreed immediately. They set out early in the morning, riding through hills dotted with sage and juniper, then descending into a broad valley where a creek rang clear and cold over smooth stones. The land was beautiful, untouched except for the occasional signs of wild game. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still holding patches of snow despite the summer heat. "This is it," Grace said, reining in her horse near the creek. "This is the land Papa has been talking about." They dismounted and walked along the creek bank. Daniel assessed the land with a rancher's eye. The quality of the grass, the availability of water, the shelter offered by the surrounding hills. It was good land, the kind of place where cattle could thrive. "What do you think?" Grace asked. "I think your father has chosen well," Daniel said. "This valley could support a good-sized herd. The water is reliable, and there is plenty of room to grow." Grace smiled, and it was the first truly happy smile Daniel had seen from her since that terrible day at the creek. "I am glad. I want Papa to have this. He has worked so hard, lost so much. He deserves something good." They found a spot under a large cottonwood tree and sat down to rest. Grace had packed food and they ate in comfortable silence, watching the water flow past. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals. "Can I tell you something?" Grace said after a while, her voice tentative. "Of course," Daniel replied. "Sometimes I feel guilty about Uncle Thomas, but then I also feel grateful to be alive, and that makes me feel even more guilty, as if I do not have the right to be happy that I survived when he did not." She looked down at her hands. "Does that make me a terrible person?" "No," Daniel said firmly. "It makes you human. You can grieve for your uncle and still be grateful for your own life. Those two things do not cancel each other out." Grace looked at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "How did you become so wise?" "I am not wise," Daniel said. "I have just lost enough people to know that the living have to keep living. It is what those we have lost would want for us." Grace reached over and took his hand, and Daniel felt his heart jump at the contact. They sat that way for a long time, hands clasped, watching the water and the sky, not needing words. On the ride back to Piach, something had shifted between them. Daniel could feel it, a new awareness, a deepening connection. He caught Grace looking at him several times, and each time their eyes met, he felt that same jolt of electricity. He was falling in love with her. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. That evening, Daniel lay in his bunk at the mine, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Grace. He had not planned for this, had not wanted to open his heart to anyone. But Grace had somehow slipped past all his defenses without even trying. She had become important to him in a way that went far beyond gratitude for her father giving him work. He cared about her happiness, her dreams, her future. But did she feel the same way? And even if she did, what right did he have to pursue her? He was a failed rancher with no prospects beyond his job at the mine. Grace deserved someone established, someone who could give her the kind of life she had dreamed about. These thoughts chased themselves in circles until Daniel finally fell into a restless sleep. The next few weeks were both wonderful and torturous for Daniel. He saw Grace regularly, and each meeting deepened his feelings for her. They talked about everything: books, dreams, childhood memories, the future. Grace told him about growing up in Missouri, about her mother's gentle nature and her father's determination. Daniel found himself opening up about his own past, about the pain of watching his father slowly destroy himself with alcohol, about the humiliation of losing the ranch. "You should not be ashamed," Grace told him during one of these conversations. "You did your best in an impossible situation. That takes courage, not cowardice." "It does not feel like courage," Daniel admitted. "It feels like failure." "Then you are measuring yourself by the wrong standard," Grace said. "Courage is not about never failing. It is about getting back up after you fall and trying again." Her words stayed with him, working their way into the wounded places in his heart. In late September, Jacob Foster called Daniel into the mine office. "I am buying the land in the valley," he announced. "The deal will be finalized next week, and I want you to come work for me on the ranch." Daniel was stunned. "Jacob, I do not know what to say." "Say yes," Jacob replied. "I need a foreman, someone who knows cattle and horses, someone I can trust. The pay will be better than what you are making here, and there is a small house on the property that would be yours." "I have watched you work these past months, Daniel. You are exactly the kind of man I want helping me build this ranch." "Then yes," Daniel said. "Absolutely yes." Jacob smiled and shook his hand. "Good. We will move out there in November after the mine contracts are fulfilled." Grace is already planning how she wants to set up the house. She is excited about this, more excited than I have seen her since before her mother died. That night, Daniel could barely sleep. The prospect of working on a ranch again, of helping to build something from the ground up, filled him with an energy he had not felt in years. But more than that, the idea of being near Grace every day, of seeing her happiness as the ranch took shape, made his heart race. He knew he needed to tell her how he felt. He could not go on pretending that his feelings were merely those of friendship. But the fear of rejection, of ruining what they already had, kept him silent. October arrived, bringing cooler weather and the first hints of winter in the mountains. Daniel and Jacob began making plans for the ranch, discussing how many cattle to start with, what improvements needed to be made to the existing structures, how to manage the winter feeding. Grace was involved in all these discussions, offering practical suggestions and asking thoughtful questions. One evening, after a long planning session in the mine office, Jacob left to check on something in one of the shafts, leaving Daniel and Grace alone. They had spread maps and notes across the desk, and Grace was studying a rough diagram of the ranch layout. "I cannot believe this is really happening," she said. "A few months ago, I had just lost Uncle Thomas and everything seemed so dark, but now we are going to have a real home, a place to belong." "You deserve it," Daniel said. "Both of you do." Grace looked up at him, and something in her expression made his breath catch. "I am glad you will be there with us, Daniel. I cannot imagine doing this without you." "Grace," Daniel began, then hesitated. His heart was pounding. "There is something I need to tell you." "What is it?" she asked, her green eyes intent on his face. "I have feelings for you," Daniel said, the words coming out in a rush. "More than friendship. I think I have had them since that day at the creek, but I tried to ignore them because I did not think I had the right. I am just a cowboy with a failed past, and you deserve so much better. But I cannot keep pretending that I do not care for you, that I do not think about you constantly, that I do not want a future with you." Grace stood very still, her expression unreadable. For a terrible moment, Daniel thought he had made a catastrophic mistake. Then she smiled, a radiant smile that lit up her entire face. "You foolish man," she said softly. "I have been waiting for you to say something for weeks. I have been dropping hints, trying to show you that I care for you too, but you seem determined to see yourself as unworthy." "You care for me?" Daniel asked, hardly daring to believe it. "Of course I care for you," Grace said, moving around the desk to stand in front of him. "You saved my life, Daniel. But more than that, you have been kind and patient and honest. You have listened to me, supported me through my grief, made me laugh when I thought I would never laugh again. How could I not care for you?" Daniel reached out and took her hands, and they were warm in his. "I do not have much to offer you right now, just a job as a ranch foreman and whatever future I can build." "That is more than enough," Grace said. "I do not need riches, Daniel. I need someone who sees me, who values me for who I am, someone who makes me feel safe and understood. You are that person." Daniel pulled her closer, and she came willingly into his arms. For a long moment they just held each other, and Daniel felt something inside him shift and settle, as if a missing piece had finally clicked into place. "Can I kiss you?" he asked quietly. "Please," Grace whispered. He kissed her gently at first, barely brushing his lips against hers, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. But Grace leaned into the kiss, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. The kiss deepened, and Daniel felt as if he were drowning again, but this time in the best possible way. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Grace laughed softly. "That was worth waiting for." "I should have said something sooner," Daniel said. "Perhaps," Grace agreed. "But the timing was right. Everything happens when it is supposed to happen." They heard footsteps approaching, and they stepped apart just as Jacob returned. If he noticed that something had changed between them, he said nothing, but Daniel caught a small, knowing smile on his face. Over the next few weeks, Daniel and Grace navigated the new dimension of their relationship while still maintaining propriety. They were not formally engaged, but there was an understanding between them, a quiet certainty that they were building toward a future together. Jacob seemed pleased by this development, though he did not comment on it directly. The move to the ranch happened in early November. Jacob had hired a few men to help with the transition, and there was a flurry of activity as supplies were hauled in. Repairs were made to buildings, and the first small herd of cattle was driven into the valley. Daniel threw himself into the work, rising before dawn and working until dark, helping to transform the raw potential of the land into something real. Grace worked alongside them, setting up the main house, organizing supplies, cooking for the workers. She proved to be as capable with practical matters as she was with bookkeeping and planning. Daniel watched her moving around the ranch yard, her hair tied back with a simple ribbon, her sleeves rolled up as she worked, and he fell a little more in love with her every day. The small house Jacob had mentioned for Daniel was really more of a cabin, but it was solid and well built, with a stone fireplace, a loft sleeping area, and 2 windows that looked out toward the mountains. Daniel spent his first evening there sitting by the fire and thinking about what it would be like to share this space with a wife, with children someday. He thought about Grace, about how she would look standing in the doorway, and the image filled him with longing. Winter came to the valley in December, bringing snow and cold but also a kind of peaceful beauty. The work continued but at a slower pace. The cattle were settled, the buildings were winterized, and there was time for rest and planning. Daniel spent many evenings in the main house with Grace and Jacob, sitting by the fire and talking about the spring, about expansion plans, about the future. On Christmas Eve, Jacob announced that he was riding into Piotch the next morning to spend the holiday with some friends from the mine, and would not be back until the day after. The other ranch hands had been given time off to go into town as well. Daniel suspected this was a deliberate arrangement on Jacob's part, giving him and Grace time alone. They spent Christmas Day together at the ranch, just the 2 of them. Grace cooked a special meal and they ate by candlelight in the main house. Afterward, they sat by the fire and Daniel gave Grace the present he had made for her, a small wooden box carved with a pattern of running horses. "I know it is not much," he said, "but I wanted you to have something from me." Grace opened the box carefully and her eyes widened. Inside was a delicate silver necklace that Daniel had bought in Piotch with most of his saved wages. It was simple but beautiful, a single turquoise stone set in silver on a fine chain. "Daniel," she breathed, "it is beautiful." "The turquoise reminded me of the sky over the valley the first day we rode out here together," he said. "I wanted you to have it." Grace turned so he could fasten the necklace around her throat, and when she turned back, tears were sliding down her cheeks. "No one has ever given me anything so thoughtful," she said. "You deserve to be thought of," Daniel said. "You deserve to be cherished." Grace kissed him then, and the kiss was different from their earlier kisses, deeper and more certain, a promise of things to come. When they pulled apart, Grace took his hand. "I have something to tell you," she said. "Papa has given us his blessing. He said that if you want to ask me to marry you, he would be honored to have you as a son-in-law." Daniel felt his heart soar. "Grace Foster, I do not have a ring yet, and this is not as romantic as you deserve, but I cannot wait any longer. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy?" "Yes," Grace said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, Daniel, I will marry you." They spent the rest of that evening making plans, talking about when they would marry and how they would merge their lives. They decided to have the wedding in February, a simple ceremony in the church in Piotch followed by a celebration at the ranch. Jacob returned the next day and pretended to be surprised when they told him the news, though his terrible acting made them all laugh. He embraced Daniel and welcomed him officially into the family. The next 2 months were a whirlwind of preparation. Grace worked on her dress, altering one that had belonged to her mother with help from Mrs. Palmer. Daniel bought a new suit and a gold wedding band from a jeweler in Piach. Invitations were sent out to friends and acquaintances, and plans were made for a feast at the ranch after the ceremony. Daniel found himself amazed by how his life had transformed in less than a year. He had come to Nevada expecting solitude and hard work, perhaps a chance to forget his failures. Instead, he had found purpose, family, and a love deeper than anything he had imagined possible. The wedding day arrived cold but clear, with the sun brilliant against the snow. Grace was beautiful in her mother's altered dress, her dark hair crowned with a simple wreath of dried flowers. When Daniel saw her walking toward him down the aisle of the church, his throat tightened with emotion. They spoke their vows in front of about 30 guests, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel kissed Grace with all the love and hope he had in his heart, and the small congregation erupted in applause. The celebration at the ranch afterward was simple but joyful. Mrs. Palmer had helped Grace prepare food, and someone had brought a fiddle. There was music and dancing and laughter. Jacob gave a toast that had everyone smiling, talking about how proud he was of his daughter and how grateful he was that she had found a man worthy of her. As the sun set and the guests began to leave, Daniel and Grace stood together watching the valley fade into twilight. Grace was wearing the turquoise necklace and her hand was warm in his. "Are you happy?" Daniel asked. "I am more than happy," Grace said. "I am home." They walked together to the cabin that was now their home, and Daniel carried Grace over the threshold, making her laugh. The fire was already lit, casting warm light over the simple interior that Grace had transformed with curtains, rugs, and small touches that made it feel welcoming. That night, as they lay together in the loft under warm quilts, listening to the wind whisper around the eaves, Daniel thought about the journey that had brought them here. He had pulled Grace from a flooded creek, thinking he was simply saving a life. But in reality, she had saved him just as surely, pulling him from the currents of grief and failure that had threatened to drown him. Grace became the current that carried his life forward, giving him direction and purpose when he had lost both. She was his home, his future, his reason for working hard and dreaming big. And he would spend the rest of his life being grateful that he had been riding that trail on that stormy day, that he had heard her scream over the roar of the water, that he had been given the chance to love her. The winter passed in quiet contentment. Daniel and Grace settled into married life, learning each other's rhythms and habits. They worked together on the ranch, planning for the spring when they would expand the herd and begin building more substantial structures. Jacob watched them with obvious satisfaction, happy to see his daughter thriving. Spring arrived in April, bringing green grass to the valley and the birth of the first calves from their small herd. Daniel worked long days, but he always made time for Grace, for quiet conversations in the evening, for walks along the creek, for the simple intimacy of shared life. In May, Grace told him she was pregnant. Daniel was overwhelmed with joy and a little fear. He remembered losing his mother, remembered Grace's story of her own mother's death, and he worried about the dangers of childbirth. But Grace was calm and confident. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she said when he expressed his concerns. "I am strong, and we will find a good midwife. Everything will be fine." Over the following months, as Grace's belly grew round with their child, Daniel found himself becoming even more protective and attentive. He made sure she did not overwork herself, brought her special treats from town, and talked to her about his hopes for their child. "Boy or girl, it does not matter to me," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. as long as both of you are healthy and safe." "I think it will be a boy," Grace said, resting her hands on her belly. "He is so active, always moving." "Then we will have a son," Daniel said, kissing her forehead. The baby came in January, on a cold night when the stars seemed to press close to the earth. The midwife from Piach arrived in time to help, and Jacob paced nervously in the main house while Daniel held Grace's hand and tried to be strong for her. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Daniel was terrified that he would lose her. But Grace was fierce and determined, and when the baby finally emerged with a lusty cry, she was exhausted but triumphant. "It is a boy," the midwife announced, wrapping the baby in clean cloths. "A healthy boy." Daniel looked at his son, at the tiny red face and waving fists, and felt his heart expand with a love so intense it was almost painful. When the midwife placed the baby in Grace's arms, and Grace looked up at him with tears of joy streaming down her face, Daniel knew that this was what life was supposed to be about. This moment, this love, this family. They named him Thomas Jacob Preston, honoring the uncle Grace had lost and the grandfather who had welcomed Daniel into the family. Little Thomas was a good baby, healthy and alert, with Grace's green eyes and a temperament that seemed to take the best from both his parents. The months that followed were exhausting but wonderful. Daniel had never known he could feel such tenderness as when he held his son, watching the baby's expressions change in sleep, marveling at the tiny perfection of fingers and toes. Grace was a natural mother, patient and loving, and she seemed to bloom in her new role. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. They added more cattle, expanded their grazing lands, and hired additional hands to help with the work. By the time Thomas was a year old, the Preston Foster Ranch was becoming known as one of the most well-run operations in the region. Jacob had stepped back from the day-to-day operations, content to let Daniel manage things while he spent time with his grandson and pursued his own interests. He had found companionship with a widow in Piach, Mrs. Palmer actually, and it seemed likely that there might be another wedding in the family's future. One evening in late summer, Daniel and Grace sat on the porch of their cabin, watching 2-year-old Thomas toddle around the yard chasing fireflies. The air was warm and still, carrying the scent of sage and grass. "You ever think about that day at the creek?" Grace asked. "Sometimes," Daniel admitted. "I think about how different both our lives would be if I had ridden a different trail that day, if I had arrived 5 minutes later." "I think about it too," Grace said. "I was ready to give up, ready to let go. But then you appeared like something out of a story and you gave me a reason to hold on. You gave me everything, Daniel. A home, a family, a future. You gave me life in more ways than one." "No," Daniel said, taking her hand. "You gave me life. When I came to Nevada, I was just existing, going through the motions. But you gave me something to live for, something to build. You became the current that carried me forward when I was lost and drifting. Everything good in my life started the moment I pulled you from that water." Grace leaned against him and they sat in comfortable silence, watching their son play. After a while, she spoke again. "I think I would like another baby. Thomas should have a brother or sister." "I think that would be wonderful," Daniel said, kissing her temple. Grace became pregnant again that fall, and the following spring she gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine Rose, after both their mothers. Catherine had Daniel's dark hair but was otherwise the image of Grace, and she quickly wrapped her father around her tiny finger. The years passed in a rhythm of work and love, of small triumphs and occasional challenges. The ranch continued to expand, becoming one of the most successful in the region. Daniel earned a reputation as a fair but demanding boss, someone who expected hard work, but who also treated his employees well. Grace managed the household and the ranch finances with quiet efficiency, and she began teaching school part-time in a small schoolhouse they built on the property for the children of ranch workers. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved horses and could often be found in the stable with his father. Catherine was spirited and curious, always asking questions and exploring every corner of the valley. They were joined by two more children over the years, another boy named William and a girl named Sarah. Through it all, Daniel and Grace remained deeply in love. They had their disagreements, as all couples do, but they never lost sight of what mattered, their commitment to each other and to the family they had built together. Every evening, no matter how tired he was, Daniel would find Grace and kiss her, grateful for another day together. Jacob did eventually marry Mrs. Palmer, who became a beloved grandmother to the children and a valuable advisor to the ranch operation. They built a small house near the main ranch buildings and spent their later years in contentment, surrounded by family. On the 10th anniversary of the day Daniel had pulled Grace from the flooded creek, they rode together back to that spot. The creek was peaceful, flowing gently within its banks, no hint of the violence it had shown that terrible day. "I want to thank you again," Grace said. "Not just for saving my life that day, but for every day since. You have been everything I could have hoped for in a husband and more." "I am the one who should be thanking you," Daniel replied. "You took a broken, aimless man and gave him purpose. You showed me that failure is not the end, that there is always a chance to build something new if you have the courage to try. You are my everything, Grace." They dismounted and stood by the creek, hands clasped, remembering that day and marveling at how much had changed. Daniel thought about the scared, tired young woman clinging to that tree, about his own desperate fear as he fought through the current to reach her. That moment of crisis had been the beginning of everything: their love, their family, the life they had built together. "The creek gave me to you," Grace said softly. "The water tried to take me, but you were stronger than the current." "We are both stronger than any current," Daniel said. "Together, there is nothing we cannot face." The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows. They lost Jacob to a sudden heart attack when he was 65, a blow that hit them all hard. But they supported each other through the grief, and they honored his memory by continuing to build on what he had started. Thomas grew into a fine young man who took naturally to ranching. He eventually married a schoolteacher from Piach and brought her to live on the ranch, building his own house in the valley. Catherine, true to her spirited nature, moved to San Francisco to work as a journalist, though she visited often and always spoke of the ranch as home. William became a horse breeder, developing a reputation for producing some of the finest working horses in the region. Sarah, the youngest, studied medicine and became one of the first female doctors in Nevada, practicing in Piach but living on the ranch. Daniel and Grace watched their children build their own lives with pride and love. They became grandparents, delighting in the next generation, watching their legacy extend into the future. The ranch that had started with a dream and a patch of valley land became a thriving operation that employed dozens of people and stood as a testament to what could be built with hard work, vision, and love. Through it all, Daniel never forgot that everything had started with a moment of choice. The decision to ride toward a stream instead of away from it, the courage to step into dangerous water for a stranger, the willingness to risk his own life for someone he did not even know. That choice had given him everything: a wife he adored, children who made him proud, a legacy that would outlast him. It had given him a reason to wake up each morning and face the challenges of the day. It had given him home, purpose, and love. As Daniel and Grace grew older, They settled into the comfortable rhythms of long married life. They still worked on the ranch, though Thomas had taken over most of the day-to-day management. They spent their days tending the garden, working with the horses Daniel still loved, visiting with their children and grandchildren, and simply enjoying each other's company. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a large celebration at the ranch. Friends and family came from all over Nevada and beyond to honor them. There were speeches and toasts, music and dancing, and an overwhelming sense of love and community. That evening, after the guests had gone and the children had returned to their own homes, Daniel and Grace sat on the porch of the cabin they still lived in, though it had been expanded and improved over the years. The valley stretched before them in the twilight, peaceful and beautiful. 30 years, Grace said wonderingly. Where did the time go? It went into all of this, Daniel said, gesturing at the valley, the buildings, the life they had created. Into our children, our grandchildren, everything we have built together. No time was wasted, Grace. Every moment mattered. I would not change anything, Grace said. Even the hard parts, the losses, the struggles, all of it led us here to this moment, to this life. I am grateful for every day. So am I, Daniel said. They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands as they had done countless times over the years. The stars began to appear, one by one, until the sky was full of light. You remember what I said to you that day in the creek? Daniel asked. When I reached you and you were so scared. You said you had me, Grace replied. You said I could trust you. And you did trust me, Daniel said. You let go of that tree and trusted that I would keep you safe. That trust, Grace, that was the beginning of everything. You trusted me with your life, and I have spent every day since trying to be worthy of that trust. You have been more than worthy, Grace said, squeezing his hand. You kept your promise, Daniel. You have kept me safe, kept our children safe, built a life where we can all thrive. You are the best man I have ever known. They kissed then, a sweet, gentle kiss that still held the spark of the passion they had shared for 3 decades. When they pulled apart, Grace rested her head on Daniel's shoulder. You know what the funny thing is, Grace said. I always think of myself as the one who was saved that day, but looking back, I think maybe we saved each other. You pulled me from the water, but I pulled you from the despair and aimlessness that had been drowning you. We both became the current that carried the other forward. You are right, Daniel said, considering this. We saved each other. We have been saving each other every day since. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the life they had built, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought them here. He thought about the young man he had been, broken and lost, riding into Nevada with nothing but a few possessions and a lot of pain. He thought about the terrified young woman clinging to a tree in a flooded creek, about the split-second decision to help her, about everything that had flowed from that choice. Life, he had learned, was made up of moments. Some were ordinary, easily forgotten. But others were pivotal, changing the course of everything that followed. That day at the creek had been one of those pivotal moments, one of those choices that rippled outward like circles in water, touching everything, changing everything. He had saved Grace's life. But in doing so, she had saved his, giving him purpose and love and a reason to believe in the possibility of happiness again. Together, they had built something enduring, something that would outlast them both. The years continued to pass gently for Daniel and Grace. They watched their grandchildren grow up, celebrated marriages and births, weathered the occasional sorrows that life brought. The ranch remained prosperous under Thomas's capable management, and the family name became synonymous with integrity and quality throughout Nevada. When Daniel was in his early 60s, he had a health scare that reminded them both of their mortality. It turned out to be nothing serious, but it prompted conversations about the future, about ensuring that everything they had built would continue after they were gone. They worked with lawyers to ensure the ranch would stay in the family, with provisions that protected all their children and grandchildren. They wrote down their histories, their memories, the stories of how they had met and built their life together. Grace wrote everything in a leather-bound journal that she intended to pass down to their descendants, so that future generations would know where they came from. One spring day, when Daniel was 65 and Grace was 63, they rode together out to the valley where they had first talked about building the ranch, where they had first begun to imagine a future together. The valley was lush with new grass, and the creek sparkled in the sunlight. "This is where it all began," Grace said. "Not at the flooded creek where we met, but here, where we first dreamed about what we could build together." "Both places are important," Daniel said. "The creek gave us to each other. This valley gave us purpose and direction." They dismounted and walked along the creek bank, moving more slowly than they once had, but still strong and capable. Daniel felt the weight of years on his body, but his heart was light. He had lived a good life, a full life, surrounded by love. "If you could go back and talk to that young man riding into Nevada all those years ago," Grace asked, "what would you tell him?" Daniel thought about this. "I would tell him to pay attention to the moments that feel significant, even if he does not understand why. I would tell him that the best things in life often come when we are least expecting them. And I would tell him that saving someone else's life might end up saving his own." He paused. "What would you tell the young woman in that flooded creek?" "I would tell her to hold on just a little longer," Grace said. "I would tell her that help is coming, and that the man who saves her will give her a life beyond anything she could imagine. I would tell her that the worst day of her life is about to become the first day of her real life." They stood together watching the water flow past, both lost in memory and gratitude. The sun was warm on their faces, and the wind carried the scent of sage and grass. This valley, this land, had become home in the deepest sense of the word. It was where they belonged, where their love had taken root and grown, where their legacy would continue long after they were gone. As they rode back to the ranch, Daniel felt profound peace. He had lived long enough to see his children grown and happy, to hold his grandchildren, to know that what he and Grace had built together would endure. He had gone from being a man with nothing to a man who had everything that mattered: love, family, purpose, and home. That evening, the whole family gathered for dinner at the main house, a weekly tradition that everyone tried to honor. The table was crowded with children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren now. The noise was tremendous, with multiple conversations happening at once, laughter and the clatter of dishes creating a cheerful chaos. Daniel sat at the head of the table with Grace beside him, and he looked around at all the faces, seeing traces of himself and Grace in each one. Thomas had Grace's green eyes and Daniel's steady temperament. Catherine had Daniel's dark hair and Grace's fierce spirit. William was quieter, thoughtful like his mother. Sarah had inherited the best qualities of both parents, combining compassion with determination. And the grandchildren were all unique individuals, each one precious, each one carrying the legacy forward into a new generation. They would inherit not just the ranch but the values that had built it: hard work, integrity, love, and the courage to take risks for what mattered. After dinner, when the younger children had been taken home to bed and the adult children were cleaning up, Daniel and Grace slipped outside for their evening walk. It was a ritual they had maintained for decades, this quiet time together at the end of the day. "You know what I realized today?" Grace said as they walked slowly through the twilight. "We have been together now longer than we were apart. My entire adult life has been spent with you, Every important moment, every significant memory, you have been there." "The same is true for me," Daniel said. "I can barely remember what life was like before you. It seems like a different person lived that life, not me." "In a way, it was a different person," Grace said. "We have both changed so much over the years. We have grown together, shaped each other." "And I would not have it any other way," Daniel said. They reached their cabin and sat on the porch as they had done thousands of times before. The valley was dark now, lit only by stars and a crescent moon. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and the night breeze carried the scent of water and growing things. "Daniel," Grace said quietly, "thank you for building this life with me. Thank you for being the man I always believed you were, even when you doubted yourself. Thank you for loving me so well for so long." "Grace," Daniel replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for trusting me that day in the creek. Thank you for seeing something worth loving in a broken cowboy. Thank you for every day since, for every moment of joy and companionship. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." They held hands in the darkness, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and had built a life that exceeded anything they could have imagined. The current that had tried to separate them on that terrible day had instead brought them together, and they had been flowing forward ever since, carried by love and determination toward a future they had created together. As the years continued to advance, Daniel and Grace aged gracefully, their love deepening with time rather than diminishing. They celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, holidays and ordinary days, always grateful for the gift of each other's presence. When Daniel was 72, he suffered a stroke that left him weakened but not defeated. Grace nursed him back to health with patient devotion, and while he never fully recovered his former strength, he adapted to his limitations with the same determination he had brought to every challenge in his life. "I am not ready to leave you yet," he told Grace during his recovery. "We still have more time together." "We do," Grace agreed. "As much time as we are given, and I will treasure every moment." Daniel lived for another 5 years, years filled with love and family and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. On a warm September afternoon, surrounded by his wife and children, he closed his eyes for the last time, his hand clasped in Grace's, a smile on his face. The valley mourned the loss of a good man, a man who had built something lasting and who had touched many lives with his kindness and integrity. The funeral was large, attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been impacted by Daniel Preston in some way. Grace stood strong through it all, supported by her children and the knowledge that she and Daniel had loved each other completely. She had no regrets, no wishes that things had been different. They had been given 46 years together, years that had been full and rich and meaningful. After the funeral, Grace remained on the ranch, living in the cabin she and Daniel had shared for so long. She continued to be involved in the ranch operations, offering advice when asked, but trusting Thomas to manage things. She spent time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing down stories and wisdom, ensuring that the family history was preserved. One day, about a year after Daniel's death, Grace rode out to the creek where it had all begun. She stood on the bank, looking at the water, remembering that terrified girl and the brave cowboy who had risked everything to save her. "Thank you," she said softly, speaking to Daniel as if he could hear her. "Thank you for seeing me, for saving me, for loving me. You gave me the most beautiful life, and I will carry you in my heart until we meet again." The water flowed on, constant and eternal, and Grace felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had been blessed beyond measure, given love and family and a life of purpose. Daniel was gone, but everything they had built together remained. Their children carried on their legacy. Their grandchildren bore their names and their values, and the ranch they had created stood as a testament to what could be accomplished when two people committed themselves to each other and to something larger than themselves. Grace lived for another decade, watching her family continue to grow and thrive. She saw Thomas's children take their places on the ranch, saw Catherine's son become a successful writer, saw William's daughter win awards for her horse breeding, saw Sarah's legacy continue through the clinic she had established in Piotch. When Grace died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 84, she was surrounded by 4 generations of family, all of whom owed their existence to a moment of courage on a stormy day so many years before. They buried her next to Daniel in the family cemetery on a hillside overlooking the valley, and the entire town of Piotch turned out to honor the woman who had been a cornerstone of the community for so long. The Preston Ranch continued for generations after that, each new generation adding their own contributions while honoring the foundation that Daniel and Grace had laid. The story of how they met, of the flooded creek and the rescue, became family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren, a reminder of where they came from and the values they stood for. The cabin where Daniel and Grace had lived for so many years was preserved as a family museum, filled with their belongings and mementos of their life together. The leather-bound journal Grace had written became a treasured family heirloom, passed down through the generations, its pages worn from reading and rereading. And through it all, the creek continued to flow through the valley, sometimes peaceful and sometimes violent, a reminder that life brings both calm and storm, and that the currents that try to sweep us away can sometimes be the very forces that bring us to where we need to be. Daniel Preston had ridden into Nevada as a broken man seeking escape. He had found instead a purpose and a love that transformed his life completely. Grace Foster had been drowning in more ways than one that terrible day, lost and alone and facing an uncertain future. Daniel had given her a lifeline, and she had used it to pull herself toward a life of meaning and joy. Together, they had become the current that carried each other forward through all the years that followed, through challenges and triumphs, sorrows and celebrations. They had proven that love, real and true and committed, could weather any storm and build something that lasted beyond a single lifetime. Their story became more than just their own. It became a foundation for generations, a legacy of courage and compassion, a reminder that the most important moments in life often happen when we choose to act rather than to turn away, when we risk ourselves for others, when we open our hearts to the possibility of love even when we think we have nothing to offer. The valley that Daniel and Grace had transformed from empty land into a thriving ranch continued to flourish, generation after generation, each one adding their own chapter to the story while honoring the beginning. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth, that on a stormy day in 1870, a cowboy named Daniel Preston had heard a scream and chosen to help, and that choice had changed everything, creating ripples that spread outward through time, touching lives that had not even been born yet, building a legacy that would endure as long as the creek continued to flow through the valley they had loved.